The most important event of 1995 and a decade as a whole was the dot-com boom, which may not seem like much today but was a huge factor in converting the analog world into digital, and single-handedly created more millionaires in a short span of time than any other event in history. Suddenly, all shops and services had to have a web presence, and some of them saw unprecedented rise in profits. It was also a year when both Java and JavaScript were released by Sun Microsystems and quickly became a major factor in website design and platform-agnostic programming. If that wasn't enough, PHP also had a final public release, and MP3 file extension for digitized music was publicly announced and changed the music industry forever. On February 15th, the most famous historical hacker, Kevin Mitnick, was arrested by FBI, leading to a crackdown on electronic criminals. Finally, a small bookstore found its presence on the web on July 15th, going by then unknown name Amazon.com. It quickly landed on a snowball path to becoming a single biggest online retailer ever. And last but definitely not least, IBM unveiled the Deep Blue computer that was soon to beat and embarrass world chess champion Garry Kasparov, sparking conversations everywhere about the future of computing and AI. It's all pretty interesting, but you're not here to learn about what happened in 1995 worldwide. You want to know about Amiga games, right? And it's as good time as any other for me to humbly ask you to hit those like and subscribe buttons below, as not only you'll always be notified when I release something, but also it would help me a lot. And if you're feeling more generous, I also have a Patreon, and all the videos are released there a day earlier. That, however, is totally voluntary, and I will never paywall any of my YouTube content. With all that out of the way, let's get back to our scheduled programming. Our scheduled subject of conversation. The world was changing in 1995 faster than ever before, and so was Amiga. The difference was that Amiga was changing its status from still quite popular, even if a bit behind PC in terms of tech gaming machine, in one that was slowly being abandoned by gamers, ignored by developers, and even forgotten by everyone. It doesn't mean that there was no more good games released for it, on the contrary, but there were many less of them than in prior years, and often they were the last titles released on the Amiga by the developers that made them. Which is somewhat fitting, as this video is the last official in this 10 years of Amiga gaming history series. There will be one more supplemental episode covering 1996 and later, but it will come in few weeks time as I have other videos planned before. Make sure to watch the video all the way through to the end though, as there's a hidden Steam game code somewhere in between the games and couple of notes on what's to come in the future of my channel, especially when it comes to those bigger and longer videos. So without further ado, let's see what most prominent titles appeared on the AMI in 1995. Even though Alien Breed 3D plays in a very small window, just a bit bigger than a fourth of the screen, it's widely considered as one of the best first-person shooters on the Amiga, despite even being one of the first few released. It received critical acclaim for the atmosphere and graphics, especially that it allows for multiple height floors on a single level, so something that even Doom's engine can't do. All that came at the price though. Not only it required AGA chipset and at least 2 MB of RAM to run, but also that's the very bare minimum, and a turbo card with some extra fast RAM is advisable for comfortable play. While Alien Breed 3D is seen as continuation of the Alien Breed trilogy of games, it stands on its own feet and would have been a good game whether the originals existed or not. On a side note, it's one of the games that was included in the official release of 2022's A500 mini console. All New World of Lemmings is a puzzle game and a third official game released in the series. Also one that's the most innovative ever since the first. While the general task of leading all lemmings safely to exit through increasingly more difficult levels remained unchanged, everything else seemed to be modified in one way or another. The titular lemmings are not a mashup of few tiny pixels anymore, but are much bigger in size, with even minute details like eyes clearly visible on them. Abilities follow the logic of less is more, so there's fewer of them, but they're more universal and not limited. They can also be extended on individual basis by picking up of extra skills spread over levels. It's an interesting choice and a fresh one, but personally I didn't like it and didn't find the game much fun. And the fact that it's another title that requires AGA chipset without justifying it in a reasonable way is what led the game to not being overly popular on the Amiga. Arcade Snooker is a follow-up to previous year's Arcade Pool, and while it's not as brilliant as that title due to some minor technicalities, it's a good game nonetheless. In essence, it's the same game played on the same engine, with a difference of snooker balls being a bit smaller than the pool ones. Or the table bit bigger, depends how you wanna look at it. And well, the rules, as it's two different games really. And those two differences are also a source of those small issues. First, balls being smaller are a reason for shots being a bit less precise when playing, and this could have been probably resolved with higher resolution display. It wasn't, so the issue prevailed, and as much as the pool is a game of skill, Snooker is a game of precision, and lack thereof creates a serious issue. Second, the rules of Snooker are not translated correctly, as after potting the last red ball, the game requires potting of yellow one, when in reality you can first focus on any other color. And last but not least, the game required AGA chipset, which was just plain stupid. It didn't look good enough to be limiting potential user base to such small subset of all Amiga gamers. But I suppose everything AGA was a fad back then. ATR All-Terrain Racing is one of the best overhead racers on the Amiga, even if a bit on the tough side. Up to 6 players can compete on one system, and if I'm to be honest, the more there are, the better ATR gets. Especially that there's a lot of replayability in the game. There are a total of 42 tracks and 3 upgradable cars to choose from. So tracks memorization and learning how to appropriately pick vehicles for them is a must for mastering this little gem of a game. ATR came out in an odd time. 1995 was a year when Commodore's been already long bankrupt after all. Amiga IP moved between many different owners, and the developers couldn't really expect the platform to last much longer. So not much care was given to some titles released for the system. ATR on one hand is extremely polished, on another it also received a CD32 port, which was a joke. It added nothing, it was basically a disc version of the game on a CD. So yeah, you can do whatever you want with that knowledge. Citadel is an interesting title. It's a first-person shooter that's not limited to AGA machines, which was a welcome sight in 1995. It's also a game that could run on basically any Amiga, regardless of the model, as long as it had at least 1 MB of RAM. I wouldn't say that playing in a very small stump-sized window on those lowly A500 systems was a great experience, but it was possible and it ran decently. And that, along with the fact that it was available to virtually all Amiga users, is what popularized the title. In all honesty, it was not the only reason, as Citadel is not a bad game at all. With multiple different interesting enemies, big levels and many weapons to choose from. That's what most Amiga gamers craved back then, even if the weapon itself for whatever reason was not visible on the screen. What's worth mentioning is incredible animated intro that really set the mood for the adventure. On the first glance, Colonization looks like a reskin of Civilization, but the fact that it uses similar tile-based engine is the confusing factor here, as despite some similarities, it's an entirely different game. For starters, it doesn't start in prehistoric time and only covers colonization period of North America. Then it focuses more on trade, training and hiring of skilled workers for various shops rather than research of new units and buildings. And finally, it also tackles subjects of contacts, relations and cooperation with natives and with old world forces that want to keep their stronghold on this new one. It's also a tale of struggle for independence and final conflict with British forces. Which on a side note is a difficult subject to tackle, as all nations strive to be independent and self-governed. Sadly, as this year has shown us, it's difficult to achieve even in our real world, where Ukraine is being currently unlawfully invaded and devastated. All that aside, I wouldn't say that Colonization tells the story of conquest of the New World as it really was, but as a background for an interesting strategy game, story that it offers works great. It's a cool title worth having and being played by any true strategy aficionado. Deluxe Pac-Man is Mr. Edgar M. Vigdal's version of the classic arcade game. And since he's of Deluxe Galaga fame, you can bet your ass that this is a masterpiece. And it is, but it's not your everyday Pac-Man. There are quite a lot of changes to the formula that, and I say it with a full responsibility of the statement, make Pac-Man a better game. The mazes are much smaller, which forces the ghost to be constantly on you, making each playthrough less strategic than original, but in the same time more action-packed, and keep you on the edge of your seat constantly. There are also numerous bonuses that were not present in original, like speed-ups, shields, score multipliers, ghost explosions, shots, and random or extra level teleports. It's, as the name correctly states, a deluxe version of the game, and one that all fans of arcade title or Deluxe Galaga should try out, as they'll feel right at home playing Deluxe Pac-Man. Doman is a medieval themed low fantasy beat-em-up that's best known for its abundance of blood and gore. It's also a Polish game and in Polish only. That said, there's never anything interesting to read anywhere, and the voiceover is barely more than some grunts, screams and shouts, so the fact that it was released only in Polish is not an issue whatsoever. After all, no one's ever played beat-em-ups to appreciate the deep and engaging story told by long, multiple screen walls of text, right? Doman's graphics have a very specific look to them, similar to previous year's title in the same genre, Franco. And since it's made by the same developer, it shouldn't be a surprise really. So, our two main characters are buff, muscular and wield huge weapons as if they weigh nothing. Where this testosterone-filled barbarian-like beat-em-up shines like dog's balls in the moonlight though? is gameplay, gore and two-player co-op. Both medieval beefcakes that the players can lead have a variety of different attacks that are also weapon dependent, meaning each weapon has a set of their own attack animations, and they can be exchanged at various specific points during gameplay. In the end, Doman is a surprisingly playable title that no one expected to be good, and perhaps because of the lack of overwhelming expectations, it managed to become one of the better original exclusive beat-em-ups on the Amiga. It also uses additional hardware, so the faster CPU and more RAM you have, the better the game will look, sound and run. Only downside I could really think of are the constant pauses between screens for Amiga to load new areas and enemies, which at least for me is a bit immersion breaking. While Dungeon Master 2: The Legend of Skullkeep at its release received mediocre reviews and did not sold well, it is actually a really good game. The issue I suspect was in expectations that grew with each passing day, and the fact that the game was delayed more than once skyrocketed those expectations to the point that the final product had no real chance of meeting them. I should know. I sold my soul to the news of Fallout 4 coming, being sure that it will be the game of games and the best RPG ever. And what I got was a very fun shooter, but absolutely horrendous Fallout and not an RPG at all. More like an interactive story where my decisions held no meaning and only pushed the pre-designed story forward. I'm digressing. Dungeon Master 2 is a grid-based dungeon crawling RPG and a natural evolution of the first title. Admittedly, I only played it on PC, so I won't touch the subject of how it ran on Amiga, as I've no real experience of that, and the footage you're seeing while recorded on Amiga is from another YouTuber's channel. Few changes were made to original formula, second outing reworked magic system, added shops, outdoor areas and improved graphics. Funny enough, the Amiga's version states on the gamebox that it requires AGA chipset, which is incorrect. In fact, it can run on any Amiga with at least 2 MB of RAM, but 1 MB of it has to be chip memory. Flight of the Amazon Queen is a point-and-click adventure game that's full of quirky humor and funny situations. While it was pointed out to me before in the video about Amiga's adventure games that it was not inspired by Indiana Jones movies, it actually was, by the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Developers themselves confirmed it, saying that while there was an Indiana Jones adventure game already, it was a movie tie-in and their game was just inspired by it. The plot takes place at the tail end of 1940s and you're Joe King, a pilot for hire, and an owner of Amazon Queen, airplane that you use for work. You arrive at Rio de Janeiro to transport your next customer, actress Miss Faye Russell, but are ambushed by your longtime rival, a Dutchman going by the name of Anderson. You're locked away by his goons in a hotel room, which is a setup point for all the shenanigans that are soon to follow. Flight of the Amazon Queen's graphics was made entirely in famous Amiga's graphics software, Deluxe Paint, which, given that it was also released for PC, is an interesting fact, as Amiga version has only 32 colors, while PC's offers as much as 256. Still, it's a beautiful looking and great sounding title that's a treat to any and all adventure game fans, and given the fact that its puzzles are not overly difficult, it's also a good title for the newcomers to the genre. Gloom is a hot mess. Not hot garbage, hot mess. And a good mess at that. It's one of the faster running on stock AGA machines first-person shooters of the time, and a pretty decent looking title, even if the pixels are between the sizes of golf and basketballs. Gloom does a lot well. It's fast and fun, full of enemies and offers a variety of weapons that sadly neither of is ever visible on the screen. But it supplements that with a constant onslaught of bodies that seem to be coming from around each corner in ungodly amounts. And on top of that, it allows for simultaneous two-player co-op or deathmatch, which, on Amiga in FPS was not that common in 1995. Interesting fact, Gloom used many sound samples directly grabbed from Alien franchise of movies, so if you're a connoisseur you can play guess from which movie the sound came from. But most important thing about Gloom was that it preceded released a year later remaster version under the name of Gloom Deluxe, which not only fixed everything that the first title did not do great, but also is the best FPS on the Amiga out of these that I actually had a chance of experiencing. High Seas Trader is a business simulation game set in the year 1650, and the goal is to get to the rank of Viscount, which guarantees the win in the game. To do so, however, you have to amass incredible wealth and trade your way to the top. High Seas Trader offers very accurate and enjoyable economical model, where certain items will always be more expensive than others based on what they are. For instance, arms will never be cheaper than grain. And also it's supply-demand based, so keeping an eye on current prices in all ports is a must. And you do so by gaining access to them via maps that you need to purchase. Preferably as many as possible, as they are your only means of discovery. If you're not into sailing yourself over huge oceans, you can hire a helmsman who will do so for you along your set course. which can be a godsend as distances between the continents are quite large, especially between some of those more profitable routes, so sailing yourself may become tiresome. Unlike similar title of Pirates, however, you can't just own and steer any ship from the get-go. You have to earn ranks that will allow you to purchase bigger and better ones. And they usually come in two flavors per rank, one that's heavily armed and other that isn't but has a much larger cargo space. High Seas Trader, after all, is a game of choice, whether to feel safer or haul more. If you should pick longer, more profitable but also more dangerous route, or stick to something safer but not worth as much. It may not be the best game in the genre, but it's a very good one nonetheless.
Then when you return,
Inherit the Earth is a really good point-and-click adventure game with just a single minor issue that we'll talk about a bit later on. The presentation is incredible, with beautifully drawn graphics, ambient sound effects and captivating melodic music that most of the time seems to fit the situation or location perfectly. See the version also featured professionally recorded voiceover for all characters in the game, but whichever version you play, it's easy just to get lost in the atmosphere and beautiful locations that are spread all throughout this title. Funny enough, given the medieval-esque feeling of the game, it actually takes place in a far future where mankind is long extinct and Earth is populated by anthropomorphic animals. Riff of the Fox tribe, the main protagonist, is falsely accused of stealing the Orb of the Storms, ancient human relic that is said to be able to predict the weather. Accusation is based on the sheer fact that he was one of the only two foxes in the area. Prejudice, I suppose, did not die off with a human race. Anyway, he volunteers to search for the orb himself to clear his name. Inherit the Earth is one of the last few great adventure titles on the Amiga and a must-play for all fans of the genre. The issue I mentioned initially is caused by the design choice of displaying a vast part of the game in an isometric graphics, which seem to cause some serious slowdowns on basic Amigas. Not serious enough to discourage from playing, but definitely unpleasant. Kingpin Arcade Sports Series Bowling, or in short, Kingpin Bowling, is my most favorite bowling game to date. It's the same thing to real bowling as what Arcade Pool was to real pool. So it's not a simulation per se, and not an arcade title either. It sits somewhere in between comfortably, in the zone where it's challenging enough not to get boring, especially when enjoyed with up to 5 other players, while in the same time it's not discouragingly difficult. It's a fun and fast approximation of a sport that works best in a group of friends when drinks are involved while playing. The only downside really would be its questionable longevity when playing alone, as then it loses a lot of its appeal quickly. By 1995, most Western developers were releasing either their last or penultimate games on the Amiga. But the system was still very popular and with steady user base in the East, in recently independent former Eastern Bloc countries like Poland or Lithuania. And the developers there did not plan on abandoning the system anytime soon. Especially that in their eyes it was still a very capable and popular machine. Enter Lost in Mine, a puzzle platformer by a Polish developer Wookiesoft. At first glance it may not look like much, but looks are often deceiving, and this is the case of that exactly. It's an excellent, even if at times mind-boggling puzzler with a very simple premise at heart. All you have to do is get to the exit. Simple as that. But it's not the destination, it's the journey. And it's that journey that is what's great and challenging about it. Unlike many other games in the genre, like Lemmings or Humans, you don't pick actions from a list of skills or buttons. You have to platform your way out, using various installations and machines spread in strategic locations around levels. And they can be any and all mining equipment, from simple drills and lifts through harvesters to even explosives, among others. Some controlled manually, other remotely at distance. Oh, and don't get discouraged by the fact that it's in Polish, as other than on the title screen you won't really see it anywhere else. Master Blaster is the best version of Bomberman on the Amiga. It focuses on multiplayer part of the game only, so there's no single player campaign. But believe me, it doesn't need it, as with up to 4 other friends for a total of 5 players on a single Amiga, it's a blast. A Master Blast. Oh my god, it's such a bad pun. Anyway, for those who'd never played either Bomberman or Dyna Blaster, Mega Blaster is a game where you're placed against few other bombers in a maze. Your goal is to incapacitate other bombers via use of bombs that when placed explode after few seconds. They can also be used to remove some of the maze's brick walls, meaning the composition of each stage changes as you play. Under some of the destroyed walls there are upgrades that can considerably enhance your bomber's capabilities. So usually at the very start of each stage, most bombers focus on destroying as many walls as they can to load themselves up with extra powers, so that they could easier defeat the enemies. And set powers can be different, ranging from extra bombs and bigger explosions to ability to throw bombs, among others. It's one of the most fun games to play with friends on the Amiga, and one that should never be approached alone. Megaball 4.0, similarly to earlier mentioned Master Blaster, is a public domain game, meaning it was distributed freely in reduced format with less levels and no level editor, but after registering and paying for a full version, all these features are unlocked. It is also the best version of Arkanoid or Breakout on the system. And with all these levels available, extra paddle upgrades and included built-in level editor, it offered hundreds upon hundreds of hours of fun. If you've never played either, let me explain. The game is a single-screen arcade title where there are colorful bricks on top of the screen arranged in various patterns, and you control the paddle on the bottom that is used to bounce the ball at the bricks to destroy them. When destroyed, they drop upgrades from time to time, which can range from simple paddle size enlargement through ability to hold the ball, to mounting paddle with cannons that can shoot powerful projectiles. The level is completed when all bricks are cleared, and you lose a life when the ball is not bounced and falls through the bottom of the screen. It's a simple but addictive mechanic. I don't think that there are many games in the genre even today that could compare to Megaball's ingenuity. Perhaps early 2000s DX Ball on PC could, but even if that's the case, it would still leave Megaball as one of the best Arkanoid clones ever made. If you like those kinds of games, Megaball is one that you should not skip. TeenAgent is widely considered as the best Polish point-and-click adventure game. And perhaps it is, but comparing it to giants of the genre like LucasArts, Sierra or even Core Design's games, it doesn't look as if it could match their quality. It doesn't mean that it's a bad game, just one that perhaps is not as good as it could have been. Anyway, the plot is kinda hilarious, gold is disappearing around Poland, because why not, and the government or police or whichever other governing body decides, and that's a good one, that a random person should be hired to uncover the reason behind the disappearances. And the choice falls on a teenager, Mark Hopper. I'd say that the logic behind the reasoning escapes my understanding, but it's a game, and by now I've seen even crazier plots in Amiga titles. Soccer Kid comes to mind, for instance. That said, the game is divided into 3 chapters, and believe it or not, but within those 3 chapters and 3 corresponding areas, the main plot can be resolved. So, to restore the missing gold, you'll luckily find yourself in the very 3 areas in the whole country that would help you solve the case. How curious. Anyway, TeenAgent is a pretty good adventure title, sometimes funny, sometimes odd, nothing groundbreaking, but a pretty decent, tad above the average game in the genre. The Misadventures of Flink is an action platformer and an excellent example of the genre that is plagued by one small but very important issue. It was only ever released on CD32. Short-lived and least spread out of all Commodore systems. So even if the company wouldn't went bankrupt, the game was unlikely to gain any serious recognition based on the size of CD32's user base. All that aside, Flink is probably the best looking platformer on the Amiga. It's a beautiful game with buttersmooth animations that could easily rival, at least graphics-wise, the best releases on consoles of the time. In fact, it was released on Sega Genesis as well. Keeping in mind that Genesis could display only 64 colors on screen at once, it makes me feel that if parallax scrolling was dropped entirely to remove the extra bit planes, it would be feasible to have it running on a regular and most widespread A500 in a reduced 32 color mode. And it still would look amazing. But perhaps was just something that the developers were not keen on attempting. One way or another, if you'll have an access to CD32 and a copy of Flink, I wholeheartedly recommend you try it, as it's a really good title. Odyssey is an action platformer released at the tail end of Amiga's commercial life, and it shows. It's beautiful, super smoothly scrolling and has crazy good designed levels. It's just a pleasure to behold even on the most basic A500. It's not a pleasure to play though, for me, as it's quite challenging during all combat encounters, especially in the earlier parts of the game. Others may enjoy it, and judging by the Lemon Amiga scores they do, but I just find it frustrating. It's not on the game though, it's on me. Still, keeping in mind that Audiogenic, the developer, were basically 2 guys who worked on the game with virtually no outside help, what they ended up with is short of magnificent. I wish I had more to say about it, but like I said, I never managed to get far in it. I do however remember puzzles being rather enjoyable and a far better part of the title than the combat was. So if that's any consolation, I like those. Pinball Illusions is a follow-up to Digital Illusions' Pinball Fantasies, which in turn was a follow-up to Pinball Dreams. Since DICE were a master of pinball on the Amiga and it was their 3rd game in the series, it's quite obvious that you could expect a very polished experience. And it was. While I wouldn't say that Pinball Illusions is as good as Fantasies, it's definitely an amazing title, and each of 3 tables that it includes poses different challenges and offers unique bonuses and minigames to unlock. Each of them is a separate and enjoyable experience. So we have Extreme Sports, Babe Watch, and Law and Justice Tables. PC CD version had one more that was Viking themed, but since it was a later release, it never got backported to the Amiga. Interestingly enough, Illusions is the first game in the series that offers a multi-ball bonus that simulates multiple balls all at once when unlocked. Perhaps it doesn't sound like anything special today, but back then it was something that was considered a missing feature in previous games that real-life pinball machines offer. Sensible Golf is nowhere near the quality of Sensible Soccer, but given the development hell it apparently went through, it's understandable. And also it does not mean that it's a bad game, because it's not, it just lacks that final finishing touch. Perhaps a couple of months more of development would have gave it that last layer of polish, perhaps. One way or another, it's a pretty enjoyable arcade take on the golf with unnecessarily difficult putting mechanics. So, not gonna lie, while it can be played alone, because of that one issue, it's much better played with up to 3 others. Cause then you're placed on the same difficulty scale, all tackling with the ungodly tough putting. Against the CPU, who doesn't seem to have any issues with it, it just seems unfair. All in all, it's one of the last 2 games Sensible Software released on the Amiga, and a pretty good title when played with friends, but skippable when approaching it alone. Despite that it was not my most favorite footy on the Amiga, looking back at it now, I agree that Sensible World of Soccer 1.1 was the absolute #1 football game on the system. I think the best testament to that would be the fact that real-world tournaments, while not as common as in the 90s, are still being held in it. And some fans even take upon themselves to update team rosters to what they actually are now. It's just mind-boggling that nearly 30-year-old game can have such grasp on its fanbase. But it's not for no reason. It's not only one of the most accessible football games of the time, but it actually plays really well. And since the graphics use couple of pixels in size players, you always get to see a pretty large chunk of the pitch, which allows for easier planning and pulling off of difficult set pieces and just makes the whole experience fun and very rewarding. Even more so when there's more gamers involved and you're playing in a league or a tournament. Sensible World of Soccer also offered very enjoyable, even if overly simplistic, management mode, where you could not only play the games but also lead your team to victory. And that's the mode I played the most, as quite honestly I seriously sucked at playing the game itself. And I really don't know why, as most of my friends were pretty good at it. Perhaps I'm just not built for sports games. Anyway, 1.1 update on prior year's release fixed the issue of gameplay stats not saving, which while not game breaking was quite annoying. Every Amiga fan should try it out whether they enjoy the sport or not, as it's very charming and hella fun. Shadow Fighter is one of the best versus fighting games on the Amiga, and also an exclusive for the system. It's probably the best Street Fighter that's not actually a Street Fighter at all. The characters are all uniquely looking and very differently playing from one another. The sprites are large and nicely animated and have a pretty decent plethora of special moves, which, comparing it to Body Blows now, another exclusive on the Amiga, makes that earlier title seem like a money grab based on popularity of the genre at the time. Backgrounds in large part are amazing too, perhaps more colorful than the foreground characters are, and I'm not sure if that's the right design choice, but it is what it is. Sounds and music are also okay, but nothing above average, so I won't mention them here again. Okay, so the most important question remains. Is Shadow Fighter as good as arcade Street Fighter 2? It's not. But it's damn close, and good fighter-hungry Amiga users didn't seem to mind. Super Skidmarks, also known as Skidmarks 2, is an isometric arcade racing video game. And basically, it's the same game as previous title, but polished, expanded and with tons upon tons of bug fixes. So there's twice as many tracks as in original, more vehicles and more competitions. The game is a bit more difficult too, which is great cause the first title was not very challenging. Apparently all because of upgraded driver's AI. The game also offers either freeway split screen mode or ability for 4 players to play on a single Amiga on a single screen with no splitting. Interestingly enough, Super Skidmarks also offered a widescreen mode where 2 Amigas could be connected with 2 screens situated side by side, which allowed 8 players to play together at once. And that was something not only uncommon but even unheard of. Same as its predecessors, Super Skidmark uses any and all extra power you throw at it. So the more RAM and faster CPU you have, the better the game runs and offers more different cars racing simultaneously. This time also with additional optional caravans for even more multiplayer craziness. While the game started its development as an add-on, it ended up as a full-fledged sequel. And good, cause it's definitely a worthy upgrade that I wasted countless afternoons playing with 2 buddies of mine in the mid-90s. Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, while looking like a dream on the Amiga, is no more than hot garbage. You will not see it here today, but you'll hear about it. The sprites are huge and graphics are simply amazing. So good in fact, I would have sworn they've been moved straight from the arcades. And that's it, really. Everything else sucks. Frames of animation are reduced to such a degree that the characters seem to be jumping from one move to another. And the game runs like a turtle in a tub of peanut butter. So not at all. It's a screenshot showcase at best. In short, it sucks. Big time. Now, what you do see on the screen, however, may not look great, play area is significantly limited, and you won't be praising sprite size or their quality either. But it runs great. And it's a big game's smaller brother, so Super Street Fighter 2 the new challengers. Now, all the stages, all the characters and their special moves, everything, absolutely everything is here and converted straight from the arcades. Most importantly, it's a blast to play, be it alone or against others. Even though it's considerably downgraded in terms of graphics, the playability has been preserved, and that's why this is by far the best Street Fighter 2 version on the Amiga. If you can, prove me wrong. Until I played Super Tennis Champs, I would have sworn that Great Courts 2 was the best tennis game for the Amiga. I'm not so sure of it anymore, because this is so playable. I'm not sure even if it's not the best tennis that I've played until the more modern 3D renditions of the sport were released. I suppose that its lack of recognition and the fact that I've never even heard about it before can be attributed to its release date. 1995, after all, was a year when most Amiga users knew that the Commodore was no more, and they started moving to other platforms, mainly PC and PlayStation, I think. Anyway, as you can see, it looks and sounds appropriately good for the time. It's also amazingly addictive in multiplayer, in which up to 4 players can play on a single Amiga, albeit with a custom parallel port adapter. In single player, it's very fast and quite challenging, which, you know, in general for the fans of the sport is good, for the rest of us may prove a reason for deterring from playing. It's worth working through the difficulty though, as even scoring that first 15 is very rewarding and it feels as if you've really improved, even if just by little. Interesting fact, there are some very basic rules of physics simulated in Super Tennis Champs, and your character when charging for the ball won't stop instantly and sort of slides for a tiny bit, losing the momentum. Ultimate Soccer Manager, or in short USM, is my most favorite football manager on the Amiga. And while I may not care for football or any other sport really, I just love football management games and played most of them over the years. USM is a game unlike most at the time. It's very accessible, meaning even someone who has little to no knowledge of the sport can grasp what's what and enjoy the gameplay loop of it. Perhaps it's a bit on the simpler side because of that, but it's very addicting. And even though it may not be the most demanding, it's one of the most extensive managements on the Amiga. You are responsible for virtually anything in your club, not only what would your regular manager's responsibilities be, so things like training, scouting, matches, etc. But you also overlook building and expansion of the ground, advertising contracts, parkings, merchandise shops, and even the prices of tickets and items in said shops. The match engine is 2D overhead view and allows for watching of full games at various speeds. It's the easiest to comprehend and follow visualization of football game in any Amiga manager. One of the most unusual features of USM, however, was ability to rig matches and also bet on them. Was it really necessary? Perhaps not, but gave depth to the title and made it a little bit more playable. If you like fun football management games or are new to the genre, USM is a perfect introduction. Virocop is a top-down view shooter not unlike Chaos Engine. It is, however, a game released at the very tail end of Amiga's commercial life, or a year after Commodore went bankrupt. So it's a very polished production, both in terms of sound and graphics. Level design is also quite spectacular, with stages being vast and varying considerably in enemies and bosses alike. Themes of the worlds that you'll visit shooting your way through hundreds of enemies will be sports, urban jungle, gods, adventure, and Silicon Valley. Same as with other similar titles, you have numerous weapons to choose from and they can be upgraded for even more firepower. Nice touch are the end world bosses that are all appropriately themed to the worlds they represent, entirely different to one another and all having their individual unique mechanics. Oh, and did I mention that you're a robot named Dave? I mean, who wouldn't want to play as a robot named Dave? Virocop is quite difficult with many enemies in some stages, and even though it may at times feel a bit overwhelming, it's so good that it never even borders on being frustrating. Interesting design choice is the addition of simultaneous two-player mode where one player controls Dave's movement and the other shooting, especially that it can be used by a single person in twin-stick control, Robotron style. Worms was arguably not only the biggest game on the Amiga in 1995, but probably also one of the most important titles for the system overall. I doubt there's anyone who never heard of it, but on an odd chance that there is, I'll quickly try to explain. In essence, it's a 2D artillery style game where your team of worms is randomly placed on also randomly generated fully destructible map, and you have to defeat in turn-based combat the opposing team of worms. Each turn has a set length predefined in game settings, usually between 30 and 60 seconds, and a whole round takes 5 to 15 minutes, after which with every turn water level keeps rising, adding to the urgency and excitement. In one turn, as long as time allows for that, you can move your worm freely, pick up upgrades, choose between numerous available weapons and shoot at an enemy. One attack per worm per turn. After all of that is complete, the enemy takes their turn. And so on until there's only one team left alive. Worms can be played by up to 4 players on a single system, and while it's very chaotic with so many people, it's also most fun. Even if it doesn't seem like much, sounding like an old concept similar to much older Scorched Earth, while playing it's really amusing and addicting. The little worms are chock full of character, commenting on in-game happenings, and weapons range from serious to unusual, incredibly creative and fun, like the banana bomb or a holy hand grenade. Combat between experienced players when most of the landscape is destroyed and worms stand on last few small landmasses shooting at each other from afar while the time keeps clocking, foretelling the inevitable deadly flooding, is some of the best and most exciting experiences on the Amiga. Exit is one of the last games released by the Psygnosis on the Amiga before they moved entirely to PlayStation. It's a 120 level strong, very polished sound and graphics-wise top-down puzzler that is very similar to Sokoban. More varied and with many more features though. Your task in each level is to create a path that would allow you to reach the exit, and you do so by moving blocks around the world levels. Most blocks can only be pushed if there's at least a block worth of empty space behind them and nothing immediately in front of them. But if that was all, the game would be considerably easier and less interesting. Exit is full of various little mechanics like glue, water, ice, switches, bombs and keys that all are there to either help you complete the level or to hinder your progress. It's not the easiest of the puzzles, so approach only if you're in the mood for the genre, but despite that, it's very entertaining and figuring out solutions to some of those more challenging levels can be really rewarding. XTreme Racing is what Mario Kart on the Amiga would be if it was ever released without the licensing for the characters. It offers 8 different characters, each with a unique vehicle and playstyle. Up to 4 players can play on a single Amiga, and 8 when 2 systems are connected via null modem and RS-232 cables. In single player there are 3 modes: a cup mode where you compete for points in one of 4 cups, each with 5 tracks, 6 cups if you have an upgraded version of the game. Then there's the tournament mode, where apart from trying to be the first, you also race for the money that can be used to purchase upgrades. And lastly, there's the time trial, which kinda explains itself quite well. But what's worth noting is that in this mode there are no opponents. In multiplayer, a definitely most entertaining way to play the game, there are 4 modes. First 2 are the same as in single, so cup and tournament. And the latter being versus mode, where you race head to head on chosen tracks, and battle mode, which is a mixture of Nintendo's Super Mario Kart and Street Racer's gameplay. Interestingly enough, released in 1996 upgrade pack not only included bug fixes and new tracks, but also additional 2 cups and most importantly a level editor, in which I must add some hardcore fans release tracks even today. Graphics wise, the game is as good as your system can handle. So on a basic A1200 it won't look great with chunky pixels and a small gameplay window, but on 060 CPU or via emulation it can be quite pretty. So, is it as good as Super Mario Kart? No, it's not, but it's the best kart racer Amiga got, and pretty good one at that. For all intents and purposes, Zeewolf 2 Wild Justice is a 3D shooter. It is not, however, one of those extremely hectic shooters where there are thousands of enemies charging at you from all sides, but one that's more strategic. Especially because each mission has their own set of objectives and the controls require getting used to. Zeewolf's missions range from various search and destroy to protection tasks, and the game can be controlled either via joystick or a mouse. There are a few kinds of weapons available, and both weapons and fuel are finite, so refueling and purchasing of additional armaments may be necessary on some of the longer missions. The game was made with all Amigas in mind, so the 3D untextured shadowed viewpoint is very limited in size to keep acceptable frame rate on all possible configurations. Back in the day, Zeewolf's graphics were considered very good, today they're fugly at best. But such is life. And as much as 2D graphics aged well, like a fine wine, early 3D ones look just awful. Gameplay-wise, Lemon Amiga users seem to love the game and praise its quality and fun factor. Personally, I didn't like it, did not play it a lot, and because of the badly aged 3D, don't plan on doing so anytime soon. So, have a look and make up your own mind if it's worth your time. There's no doubt that there were some interesting games released in 1995 on the Amiga. I'm sure you all agree. What was painfully obvious, however, is that it was a year when many of the developers finally abandoned the system. Some leaving behind impressive titles as farewell gifts to the community, others by just disappearing and moving to more future-proof or popular platforms. And while official games were still coming for the next few years, they were few and far between, and less with each passing year. Eventually commercial releases stopped popping up on the Amiga altogether, and only fans kept releasing titles and ports from other systems from time to time, PC being the major source of those ports. In the last few years some actually new games came out on the Ami, but given that the system is all but resurrected and the user base shrinks with each year, they can hardly be called successful. While all this sounds sad, the community is still strong and Amiga is my most melancholically remembered system of yesteryear that I play games on from time to this day. Mainly through emulation though, but I suppose that's how it will remain forever engraved in history of gaming. Emulated long after all the old machines will have their capacitors break and disk drives fail in years to come. If you've got to this point, first of all, I'd like to thank you for watching the video, perhaps even the whole series all the way to the end. I didn't expect to have as much fun as I did working on it, and I also found some games I forgot about over the years, and even learned of new ones I never even heard of before. It was an adventure and a very sentimental one at that. But it's hardly over. There's one more supplemental video coming in foreseeable future, covering Amiga games 1996 and later, and I'm also considering somewhere in between the shorter videos to start either MS-DOS games history similar in format to this one, or maybe C64. For both I think I'd stick to 10 most active years, same as I did here. That, however, is a plan for the near future. In the meantime there will be more usual content, and since those standard videos are considerably smaller undertakings, I should be able to release more of them more often for the next week or two. So if you liked it, hit those like and subscribe buttons below. It really helps a lot. And if you're in a more generous mood, you may even consider joining my Patreon. All the details are in the description below, but it will help me release more better content and maybe even get a camera. Who knows? For now, however, this is all, so have a good one and I'll see you next time.